Hello. Now, I had a wonderful time yesterday at the British Library, one of my favorite places where it's possible to access all sorts of materials. And somewhat surprisingly, for the research I was doing, I came across a new take on that verse. If you are a cross-dresser, is one verse you probably will know, even if you don't know any other in the Bible, if you come from the Jewish or Christian faith. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 5. Which talks about the prohibition of wearing the clothes of the opposite sex. Now, the particular writing I came across, I've discussed this verse in great detail in another video. I'll put the link for that in the description. And even almost as soon as I finished recording that video, I realized there were things that I hadn't mentioned. That's always the nature of this. For example, the fact that it's often thought that this was a verse referring to military dress, primarily, specifically banning women from wearing clothes that mark them out as being part of the militia. However, that's a little bit of an aside here. This particular new take I came was offered by someone who, at the time this was written, it was actually a collection of essays that came out of a symposium organized by King's College in London, the theology department there. And I think he was a doctoral student in that college at the time, Steffan Mathias, and he'd written a paper called Queering the Body, Undesiring Sex in Leviticus, very specifically focused on one of the verses in Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 22, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. And he went on to discuss that in some depth. But on Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, his translation is, there shall not be on a woman an object of the man, nor shall a man wear a garment of a woman. Now, he makes the point that the Hebrew here, not being a Hebrew scholar, I am reliant on those who are. The word in the first section here, kli gaver, refers not specifically to a garment. It does include clothing, but it can also include a tool, an implement, or a weapon. In other words, it's got a broader definition. So that's in connection with what a woman should or should not do. So it's not just wearing clothes, but it's taking on the arms, the bearing, the objects of a man. The second section, where the reference is to a man not wearing a garment, Hebrew here is simlat, does specifically refer to the wearing of a garment. And he says that the use of the term for a man, in Hebrew that is ish, carries what he calls heightened overtones of masculinity, valor, and strength. All of this, as I think I mentioned in my earlier video on this subject, occurs in the context of a range of laws relating to the idea of not mixing things, so not putting a donkey and an ox together, mixing seeds in a field, making clothes out of wool and linen weaved together, for example. Now, picking up on Mathias's writing again, he says that according to the Dutch Israeli biblical scholar Atalia Brenner, clothing supplies visual parameters for the sexual identity of males and females. So in other words, the argument here is that the anxiety about wearing the clothes of the opposite gender is more about sexual and social roles, identity. A woman being prevented by this ruling from anything that allows her to perform as a man. So carrying weapons, tools, limiting her chance to imitate the opposite gender, take part in economic production, and so on. And indeed, an important theme in this essay was around the whole idea of penetration, has sexual overtones, of course, but the idea that in this society, a woman, as it were, needed to know her place. And therefore, the anxiety was more about if a man takes on the clothes of a woman, it's not so much that that's prohibited itself, but it identifies him with taking on the role of a woman, which Mathias says was very much in the private, domestic sphere, and in the social order, this patriarchal social order, that is the domain that a man dominates. According to the Israeli-American theologian academic Daniel Boyarin, a man doesn't transgress the gender boundary by performing most of the tasks of a woman. However, it is by placing, wearing the clothes of a woman, he effectually crosses over into the act of what he calls being a woman. And he makes parallels with this verse in Leviticus. There's some grammatical, he's a Jewish scholar and understands the Hebrew. So he's looking at the semantics of that. And it's all about, in that verse, apparently about not so much a woman's garment, but a woman's, as he translates it, lyings. In other words, again, the power relationship between male and female, which seem to be very important for the writers of Deuteronomy and Leviticus to make this point about social roles. So for him, and also for Mathias, this verse isn't about the mixing of two things so much that really is the big issue, but the idea of a man and a woman crossing over boundaries that were quite clearly defined in their society, and, as it were, the sexual practices in which knowledge and power are constituted around the male's dominance, essentially, in endorsing the role of the man in the household, and therefore, by implication, as it were, prohibiting or making an abhorrence the idea that a man could be feminized and take on a feminine role. So just to sort of summarize that, Mathias concludes, the possibility cannot be entertained that the male can become feminized in terms of power, or that the feminizing or subjugating act of being penetrated can be tolerated. For a male to be penetrated is to reject discourses of male power, and the cohesiveness of the male subject itself comes into question and is exposed as a fabrication, in that it is made and must be defended. So an interesting perspective, this one. It seems that a number of scholars have looked into this and taken this particular interpretation. As I did with the first video, I'm really just offering this as a possible explanation of what this verse means. I think this is pretty convincing for me. As I say, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't really know what these words mean, but taking what we are told as true, it does certainly seem that there are different words used here for which relate more to role and performance, as it were, one of the social roles that a woman or a man should take on. So again, perhaps another verse that when we just look at an English translation, very often something has been lost in translation. It wouldn't surprise me if I come back to this verse again in future videos as more is discovered, as I discover more theories around it.